Well, so I think we'll get started. We have a number of committee members on Zoom. So I just want to acknowledge 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 individuals, and then maybe you could unmute and let me know if I've forgotten you. We have Senator Tipping representing the Senate President's office. We have Penny Jordan. Is she online? Yep, there you go. Hi, Penny. We have Eric Venturini. Not yet.
Look like, yeah, you did mention he might be late.
Oh, right, that's right. We have Heather Spalding. I see her logo, so we're going to assume she's there. We have Holly Francis. Hi, Holly. And I think that's it. So welcome, everybody. And thank you for being at the, what is this now, 5th? I think 5th meeting of the group. And we're going to be spending most of the day today either hearing report outs on the 2 subcommittees that met to speak with agricultural workers and farmers, or sort of really doing a deep dive into, well, what does this all mean, and what might be able to, what might we be able to make of the information that we heard to achieve the executive order's mandate. So we're going to start by just reviewing the working agreements, and then hearing report outs, and then coming up with initial options for addressing the executive order, and always providing an opportunity for public input. But before we get started, any opening remarks that
I don't think you introduced yourself, actually.
Jody Sapphire. I serve as Special Assistant to the Commissioner of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and I've been serving as facilitator for this process.
Great, thank you. I'm Nancy McBrady. I am the Deputy Commissioner of the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And as Jody so nicely said, welcome to the 5th meeting of this committee. I do think it's going to be a productive conversation, reporting back on the activities of the last 2 weeks. Before we do that, I also would like my co-chair here to introduce himself, and then we can do an in-person roll call or introductions of other committee members.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Moyer-Lee. I'm the newish Director of Labor Standards at the Department of Labor. I'm in today substituting for Commissioner Laura Fortman, who's on vacation, although I have a feeling she's probably in a hotel room watching this right now. But I'll do my best to fill her shoes today.
Perfect. You want to go through the,
Oh, yeah. So do we want to start with introductions?
Sure. Arthur Phillips, Maine Senator, right now.
My name is Tom Harnett. I am here representing Rachel Talbot Ross, Maine Speaker of the House.
Steve Miller, representing Maine Dairy Farmers Association, Dairy Industry Association.
Juana Rodriguez Vasquez, Executive Director of Lada.
Shelley McGuire, I'm with Maine Farmland Trust.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Schlobom, Executive Director of the Maine AFL-CIO.
And Ann Macri, Assistant Attorney General.
Mike Ware from Pine Tree Legal Assistance.
Jeannie Tapley, representing the Maine potato industry.
And
Dylan Murray, Legislative Liaison for the Department of Labor.
man extraordinaire. Well, so what we do is we start out every meeting reviewing the working agreements, and I want to hone in particular on a couple today. We do try our best to start meetings on time. We will definitely end this meeting on time, largely because I have an appointment that I have to be at. We try our best to meet in person when we're able, and then keep our videos on when we are on Zoom to the best extent possible, so we can see you and know that you're in the room. We try our best to share meeting materials in advance, and I think we accomplished that this time, and we will do the same next time. We will have a meeting in 2 weeks from now, and we'll try to get the meeting materials out a week in advance. We assume that you've come prepared, that you've read the meeting materials, and we're just asking that while you're here, you be as present and engaged as you can be. and that you strive for some equal airtime. Many of you sort of are internal processors, and if we can make sure that we hear from you today so that we know what your perspectives are. These next two, I think, are most critical since we'll be hearing about report outs from the two different subcommittees that you are likely, depending on what your perspective is coming into this process, that you may hear perspectives that you don't agree with or that you have some trouble with. And I just would ask that you listen, particularly with curiosity and an openness to learning and understanding. And that ultimately our job here is to create a work product. Ideally, if we're able to achieve consensus, all the better, so that we pivot and adopt a creative problem-solving orientation as best we can. That we name the tension kindly and that we never abandon humor, even in the face of serious issues. So feel free to inject that. We're gonna report out and ask that the farmer listening session first report out, and then we'll move on to the agricultural.
All right, so everyone, as you may recall from our communications to the committee, the subcommittee for farm employers was organized to meet 3 times. These were listening sessions, and 3 were held in the span of 2 weeks. The first one was at the University of Maine, Machias on the 1st of November. The second was the 6th of November in Presque Isle at the Maine Potato Board office. And then last week was our 3rd one on the 8th. That was held at the Department of Agriculture here in Augusta. All told, we had 31 participants who gave their time and their input. And we did ask that they answer the 3 questions you're familiar with about whether or not there was support for the minimum wage being required by law, whether folks were paying $13.80 at present, and then what ideas they might have for implementation of minimum wage for agricultural workers in statute. And what I'm going to do is tee up the major themes that we heard back, but also ask that my subcommittee members who are here today, either remotely or in person, also provide context and additional color to the conversation because they were there, they were engaged, and can add to providing additional context. And those members were Keith Miller from the Maine Dairy Industry Association, Penelope Jordan on behalf of the Maine Farm Bureau, Eric Venturini from the Wild Blueberry Commission of Maine, Holly Francis from the Passamaquoddy Wild Blueberry Company, and Jeannie Tapley from the Maine Potato Board. So first and foremost, the biggest key takeaway was that producers are paying at least the state minimum wage. There is some additional layers to unpeel with respect to that. Essentially, we heard virtually from everybody that due to the fact that there's just limited workers available in the state of Maine, that employees absolutely have to pay the minimum wage or above. In many cases, substantially above the minimum wage in order to have their agricultural businesses continue to operate. Some of these employers are providing housing and transportation. And some employers, many of which also mentioned that they do pay bonuses as well. So really the key takeaway was no one said they're not paying the Maine minimum wage, and that they understood the value of that minimum wage. Does anyone want to add to that from the committee before I move to major theme number 2?
And before you do, because I'm seeing a number of people writing madly, we have handouts that we will, I don't like giving handouts before people speak because then people just read and they don't listen. And so we will give these out right after the presentation. So, and it's fully captured. So just saying.
Sorry, Nancy, before you go on,
Yeah.
can I just, I know you can't share anything about the identity of the participants, but do you feel like that range of the 31 participants sort of represented the breadth of the Maine the different Maine agricultural industries? Like, was there a blend of smaller employers, bigger businesses?
Terrific question, and thank you. I probably should have mentioned that to the start. Yes, I do believe that we had a good showing of many different parts and types of the broad spectrum that is Maine agriculture. We had representatives from wild blueberries, both from the grower and the processor perspective, small as well as mid-size and large. For potatoes, I believe we also saw many producers in the mid as well as large range. There was also a large broccoli represented, a large broccoli producer represented there. For dairy, we had a very large dairy speak, as well as, what would you say?
Small to mid-size.
To mid-
Both, I would say.
Yep. We had a few apple growers call in that I don't believe were particularly large. And broccoli, blueberries, potatoes, dairy, apple, and then we had some, and some of those were organic, I should mention as well. And then we had some small vegetable growers as well, also one or two were organic too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
That's.
The next takeaway was that there is general support for legislation for an agricultural minimum wage. However, many speakers stressed concern about making ag workers employees under current law, mainly under Title 26, as we have mentioned so many times, subchapter 3. The ideas put forward were that any legislation would need to be thoughtful and nuanced, recognizing the key differences and attributes about agriculture, in particular that it's an extremely dynamic industry. There is no one size fits all representation of this industry, but it does have factors that make it quite unique. It's weather dependent. There are different crops and products and different scales represented throughout all of Maine agriculture. Many deal with live animals or perishable products, and the seasonality of the of Maine agriculture can also differ just from a geographic standpoint. Maine agriculture in southern Maine is different than up in the county as well. So to recap, while there is support for agricultural minimum wage, there was hesitancy to say it needed to go within subchapter 3. At this point, I'd invite my subcommittee members to add any additional insights.
And since many of you are on the line, feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you if you felt like something was missed. And I also want to acknowledge that Heather's on a bus right now, so that's why we're seeing her Mofka's logo. So hi, Heather. Go ahead, Penny.
Yeah, I don't think Nancy really missed anything, but I really want to emphasize the varying characteristics of agriculture, and I know you guys have heard this from me 1,000 times, but seasonality varies based on geographic location, and it also is based on the types of crops that are grown. It also is based on, you can be in the summer, and I know Eric can talk about this better than I can. You have a crop that is short season, get the greatest amount in the shortest period of time. So all of those dynamics, it may sound simple at first blush, but as you take each aspect and each type of the industry, I truly believe you need to drill down and understand how compensation can work relative to the characteristics of the industry itself. So it's not a simple solution. I'm going to reinforce it's not a one-size-fits-all industry. And I think that that's something that we really need to delve into.
Thanks, Penny. I'm going to suggest that we sort of limit our remarks now to either clarifying questions or if something hasn't been clear about what was said. Let me take Senator Tipping, and then we'll move on to the next point.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The concerns about the definition of employees in subchapter 3, were there any specific policy concerns there, or was that kind of the same confusion or general concern that we've heard before?
I will speak to that, Senator, in more detail in just a couple of points. So great question.
Okay, let's move on then.
The third theme we recorded is that there's a desire for a piece rate exemption. There was a lot of support for creating a piece rate exemption to the minimum wage in the wild blueberry industry, but I'll also note that piece rate is also utilized elsewhere in agriculture, including in broccoli. That was emphasized by one of the broccoli participants. Piece rate is seen as an incentive that helps during the short harvest window of many of these crops. Farmers adjust the piece rate based on crop load, i.e. higher per unit for lower yielding fields or years, and a lower per unit for heavier yielding fields or years. I'll let Eric or Holly mention that in greater detail if they'd like. And those adjustments are made to ensure that there is good money for good effort. We also heard that it can be hard to monitor or track field work consistently by employers. And in order to ensure that people were in fact performing to standards under the minimum wage would require more staff at that point. There was also a very specific suggestion around piecework that there would be a cultural exemption that would allow for piece rate not to be subject to the minimum wage. This would allow for employment of individuals who choose to work primarily for the social or cultural experience, but are not working enough to actually earn the minimum wage. Eric, would you like to add to any of this or emphasize, clarify?
I think that you covered it really well. I guess maybe I'll just add to a question earlier for this, and I think really everything else you're saying, all the major themes were expressed across scales of agriculture and across, models of agriculture. And so these are not, coming from one corner or another.
Thank you. Okay. The fourth theme that was surfaced was the request for a youth wage. Many producers urged a lower youth minimum wage rate to allow farmers to give young, less productive workers just starting out opportunities to learn the business and to foster their development and responsibility. Requiring the standard minimum wage will result in fewer youth employment opportunities. This was asserted by a number of producers that spoke. Many producers did describe how middle and high school rakers, wild blueberry rakers, had positive developmental experience working in the wild blueberry arena. Parents ended up telling some of these producers that their children had learned a sense of responsibility and the value of work, even if they raked just a few boxes a day. Anything to add to that, Holly or Eric or anyone else who was there?
I would just say one thing about that. I mean, I think, when we talk about using, especially some of the younger youth, it's at least with the dairy industry, it's not being widely used. And many times it's the neighbor or the neighbors, hopefully the neighbors, the worker themselves comes, but the neighbor's family says, is there anything you can find for my child to do? And most of the time it's, yeah, not really, but you try to find something for them to do because you just want to do what you can do for these younger people to try to give them some work ethic in that. And I'm afraid if that salary got too high as minimum wage creeps up, that won't be people doing that. So I think that's the concern with these areas.
Thank you.
All right. Speaking now to the fifth theme, and I think this does relate to Senator Tipping's question about more specificity. And that does focus on concerns about potential future overtime legislation. Although the minimum wage was the focus of these listening sessions, most producers also took the opportunity to stress their concerns that overtime requiring time and a half payment would be required next or sometime in the future. The producers are concerned that situating ag employees with the existing employee definition of subchapter 3 might allow the overtime requirement to be imposed more readily in the future. And then they just really stressed that producers need the flexibility to work long hours when necessary. If, for instance, weather or crop load or unpredictable circumstances arise, and many people spoke to the rainy, horrible 2023 field season as an illustrative example of this. And folks did tease out that Maine is not a year-round agricultural state like California or Florida, which is why there can be such short bursts of necessary productivity required. A couple other notes under this same topic. Producers advise that they might have to limit their hours offered to 40 hours per week, which would result in their workers earning less in income. These would make Maine agricultural jobs less attractive and ultimately result in having few workers in agriculture in Maine. And it could also result in some farms scaling back their production. Many producers in agriculture in Maine, such as dairy, wild blueberries, and potatoes, are price takers and not makers. This was stressed a number of times. What that term means, takers and not makers, it's essentially these are products that are subject to controls outside of the direct control of the producers themselves. For instance, dairy is subject to commodity pricing that is established at the federal level in a very complicated, arcane way, and therefore dairy producers aren't able, if they're in that instance, not able to raise their own prices. So in essence, many in agriculture, not all, but many would not be able to raise the prices to cover the additional costs. And they just stress that as input costs continue to rise, their margins are getting tighter regardless. We did hear from some producers who are paying overtime, who are proponents of overtime. One in particular challenged the concept that overtime was not a possibility and that worker requirements wouldn't be accommodated. So I do want to say that there were different voices and opinions heard at these meetings.
Is there industry or were there industry trends or patterns in that overtime support?
No, one was a very large dairy producer was supportive of overtime, and one was a small vegetable farm with a limited number of employees. So, yep, Sean? Yep.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for the report. Just a clarifying question for me. At the outset of this process, we said this is what the executive order wants us to look at. And we're putting things off the table. And one of those was overtime. And now we're hearing, well, the concern is overtime. When we were told we're not talking about overtime. We're talking about, as the governor set out, a minimum wage for farm workers. I'm very concerned that we then use this specter of overtime to influence the central charge of this committee, which was to talk about minimum wage. And I would add to that, there's no predicting the future, there's no binding future legislators as to what they're doing. But we were asked one specific topic to focus on. And we did that. And now I'm hearing something else.
I recognize that, and I don't disagree with you that the executive order is very clear. And in fact, when we were having these listening sessions, I clarified and did make clear on a number of occasions that the focus of this committee in particular is about minimum wage, and we really needed answers to those questions. I did not, however, censor folks from providing their opinions. With that, beyond that, they gave that of their own free will and felt very passionate about having that stated, hence reporting out on that. I can understand your reaction. I do think that, you know, I also have made clear to people that there's no controlling the future, to your point. I just need to underscore that this is being felt and spoken about and reported back on by these folks in the agricultural community. So they're having a hard time decoupling it, no matter how much we try and tell them how focused we are.
I would just want to say a little bit, not more, but I think Nancy explained it very well, but I just want to express to you, Tom, that every time that was brought up, the first person that brought that up, there was explanation that was not part of our charge. And it wasn't anything to do with this, but at the same time, when we were talking about what we were going to report back on this group, there was so many producers that mentioned that we just felt we had to at least report back to this group that was a concern.
Getting close to the end. The second to last theme was essentially.
Oh, hold on.
Oh, sorry.
Eric, sorry, I didn't catch you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just, you know, to the conversations around overtime, you know, reiterate what Heath said. First of all, it was a very clear theme, despite what was asked, you know, specifically in the questions. But also, it wasn't entirely separate because some folks were also talking about, by removing the exemption, the mandatory overtime above 80 hours, is it, right? And that being a challenge as well. So if the exemption is removed, I believe we would be dealing with a small change in overtime that would still be felt by ag.
Correct. Do you have a follow-up question about that?
I do, because I thought the exemption we were talking about is a voluntary one. It does not prevent one from working in excess of 160 hours every 2 weeks.
Correct.
I think a lot of that was the concern that that the industries would lose their flexibility. Just because while most of them hope that they would volunteer, their employees would volunteer and come. I know in the potato industry this year, we had 2 weeks for harvest and that was it because of the rain. There was a lot of crops that got left in the ground because of the rain. And so losing that ability to make sure that your staff is there, they really had to bust to get as many crops as they could out in those 2 weeks. So they went over. We have a lot of producers that ended up having to go over that limit on mandatory overtime. And so there's the fear of taking that away, that they're not going to have enough staff to be able to get their crops to the ground.
Did they get the staff to perform the work that was needed to be done, or did people say they didn't want to work?
The staff showed up for those 2 weeks. I mean, there was crops left in the ground, but mostly because we just had the worst weather possible this year. So the rain. But the staff showed up for those, but of course we have an exemption on that limit on mandatory overtime right now. And so there's a concern of losing that and then being forced to not have enough staff to get the crops to the ground.
Thank you.
The sixth theme is a question, essentially questioning the cause for minimum wage proposals. It stated another way, as one producer asked, what is the problem we are trying to solve? Farmers are paying the minimum wage. Many farmers spoke about high worker retention rates year after year. And the question was posed, why would our employees be coming back if this isn't working for them? And it was also stressed that agriculture at the end of the day is a business. And if the numbers don't work for a business, these farms may fail. And last but not least, another theme was there are larger issues at play beyond minimum wage that impact the long-term sustainability and viability of agriculture in Maine and across the United States. Consumers, unfortunately, fundamentally don't value the true cost of food. So they are not paying enough for the cost of production and what it takes to produce food in America. Farmers often pay their workers first or more than they pay themselves. Many producers or a family member will work off farm to make additional income. And ultimately, other policies and societal support are needed to increase farm sustainability and profitability. So those are the 7 key themes.
Questions, sort of clarifying questions. Yes, Arthur.
Thanks so much for that report back there. On the piece rate exemption piece, I think you made reference to the rate changing depending on the yield. Can you say a little bit more about that? Or I don't know if Eric's the right person to speak to it.
Yeah, Eric, did you hear that question, or Holly? It's about the rate changing with yields.
Yeah, so basically if you have a really high crop load in a given year, it's easier to rake, a lot of boxes and do really well. But the challenge is that if you have a really poor year with, low yields, it's harder to get, enough boxes to really make the whole piece rate system work as well. And so producers are aware of that and they adjust the rate so that even in a year, or we heard at least from some that said they adjust the rate. And so even in a year when there's not as much crop out there, per square unit in the field as they would like, they're getting enough per box that it still makes that piece rate incentive structure work. So that's what they were referring to. Does that answer your question, Arthur?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, you think that piece rate has fluctuated quite a bit depending on what the yield is, and is that set? I'm curious when that is set. If you can speak to kind of how that's set and how the seasonal yield is projected, and then how they determine what that rate might be.
Well, that would be a business by business decision. And so it's, they look at the field and they see what's, the field likely to produce and make the decision that way. But I don't know when necessarily that decision is made, but it's certainly business by business. It's not like a statewide rate is set every year.
Any other clarifying questions before we move on to the other committee report? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the report out as well. And thank you to all those that organize these listening sessions. I think it's really helpful to hear these perspectives from producers. So just thank you for the effort that went into that. I have just a question about the piece rate exemption part and the piece about cultural exemption. And just wondering if from the perspectives that were shared during the listening sessions, would that exemption be needed if there was a overall piece rate exemption, or would that cultural exemption only be needed if there wasn't sort of that broader piecework exemption? So I'm wondering about the relationship between those two potential exemptions.
Yeah, that's a great question. Eric, did you want to try that?
Yeah, sure. I think I look at it as an either or. I don't think you would need both. If there's an overall piece rate exemption, then that's what folks would use. But at least in our industry, it's as we presented to you, to this committee, kind of the why. I think that was one idea that was offered by a particular grower in the listening sessions, that maybe some sort of a waiver that a business would fill out, kind of citing a cultural, reason to exempt from the state minimum for their piece rate is what was presented. So yeah, I'd say it's one or the other, if that answers your question.
Thank you. Senator Tipping?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I guess just following up on what was asked before, a big part of the creation of this committee was because of the governor's veto, and it wasn't because of opposition to any policy passed by the legislature, and in fact, there was, expressed support for protecting farm workers under the minimum wage, but specifically confusion and the need to clarify for all affected parties what the bill does and does not do. And so I'm glad that there was some effort at least to clarify in these sessions, at least the focus of this committee and what our mandate is. But I do find it unfortunate that some of that confusion seems to continue and was repeated here kind of uncritically and without clarification. So I hope we can be more clear about that in the future and hopefully address those concerns. I guess I wanted to ask, the reason these subcommittees were created and were made in a way that wasn't public was, at least to my understanding, so people could say some things that they wanted to say without attaching their name to it or being seen to do it publicly. So far, I haven't heard anything different than what we've heard, many times over the last year. Were there specific instances of things said that was new information or new concerns that the subcommittee process for this side at least brought to the surface?
I think, just speaking for myself, it was interesting to hear many, not all, but many folks who were a part of these listening sessions talk about wanting to find a different way to move forward with minimum wage, separate and distinct from Title 26. That wasn't something that I had been particularly attuned to at the department myself. And so while Senator people didn't necessarily say, and this is what we should do instead, it was, again, more of this representation in that agriculture, being the dynamic and unique industry that it is in the state of Maine, being separate from Title 26 and subchapter 3 was something that was more nuanced and different than what I had heard in the past.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Sorry. And you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, because I did not attend any of them. It's just hearing the report outs of them as we planned for this meeting. But was there also any sort of confirmation that the group was unaware of to begin with around the uniformity or unanimity of farmers already paying minimum wage, or did you all? So that was somewhat new to me, but I wasn't sure if it was new to the subcommittee.
Yeah, taking a step back, I do think that this committee's work in gathering a lot of data, published data relative to minimum wage payments in Maine has been very illuminating. And then likewise, these workers, employers that participated were very unequivocal that they are paying the minimum wage. So I do think, Senator, that this has been brought to the fore in a way that was not as crystal clear in the past. So I do think that there has been benefit from that, where I think we've answered that question.
I'm gonna take Penny and then go back to you, Senator Tipping, if you have another question.
I just want to reinforce that I think that what I heard from at all three sessions is that farmers are paying significantly above minimum wage. They're paying $18 to $20 an hour. Many of them match the H-2A wage, hourly rate. The other thing, and I think this was right on the mark, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What is it? Because, and many of the farmers said, we're already doing this, so what are we trying to solve? And several of them said, if what we need is to put codify something into law, then let's do it under agriculture. And as Nancy said, not under subchapter 3. So those came through loud and clear and very consistently.
Thank you. Do you want to comment at all just about?
Yeah, just to say to the senator's question, our subcommittee presentation is going to come back to that point from the farm worker subcommittee perspective of why confidentiality was so important to us soliciting input from farm workers.
I would just comment really quick. Well, go ahead if you want.
No,
I was just gonna comment on kind of the questions that along with our report back here, but I think for me, it wasn't surprising to find out that our farmers were paying. I think the biggest thing that I took from it was how important the piece rate was for a couple of our industries, and how important the youth rate could be important on a couple of industries. And I didn't realize that. I mean, I know that Eric and Holly presented to us, but I didn't get that out of the presentation like I did hearing from the farmers. And then to the first part of Senator Tipping's question, I think we don't quite understand, or most of us don't quite understand how small of a business these farmers are. And none of them have somebody, they don't have a policy person that reads everything that comes in. And I'm not sure that they were actually confused or misinformed, but most of these farmers are getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning thinking, how are they gonna get everything done today? And reading some of the stuff that we sent them is probably not on their top priority. So, I mean, you know, a lot of things, I was actually surprised at how much a couple of years ago when we had legislation, how many farmers we got in the room, because farmers just don't come out and express their concerns. They just don't have time. And I think for this, we got farmers to come and talk to us that probably wouldn't have come into this big scary room. But we didn't really get anything out of them that we wouldn't have got out of them if they did come into this big scary room. But it was just a place that they maybe felt more comfortable, and hopefully the employees did too.
So we had Matt and Tom, but I didn't know who was first, so you fight it out.
Well, first I wanted to just say, I find this tremendously helpful and I applaud the work. I know there are, process questions and concerns, but I do think this seems very valuable in just providing like a snapshot, and I'm sure the farm worker piece will as well. I feel pretty crystal clear on there's no one size fits all sentiment, the sort of variability, the seasonality, all those things. That makes perfect sense to me, thinking about Maine and thinking about farms here. I'm sort of hung up on this notion that that we're making farm workers employees, and just want to unpack that a little bit, because clearly from every presentation we've had to date, the vast majority of employment laws already apply to farm workers. Farm workers are clearly employees under the law in 100 different ways. A.D. Macri walked through all that. But you, Nancy, articulated that people expressed a very real concern about making people employees under sub 3. And so I just want to better understand that, because I'm hearing essentially we're fine with minimum wage, sort of conversation, disagreement about carve outs, et cetera, to come. But by and large, we pay it, we're fine with it. And the only other, I heard the only specifics about sub 3 were some people expressing concern about this having the total control to force someone to work more than 160 hours, the mandatory overtime piece, right? So can you just help me, is this more of a symbolic concern, or is there, because we're talking pay stubs, we're talking which already exist, we're talking right to rest breaks, unpaid rest breaks, which with a lot of flexibility, which to some degree already exists, and then we're talking mandatory. So I'm really just trying to better understand that so we can sort of figure out path forward.
I think that is a great question, and one for further conversation that I think maybe in the latter half of our meeting today, we can start unpacking. Okay, yeah, so hold that thought.
Yeah, duly noted. I've made a note. Tom.
Thank you. And I think this is a clarifying question. If it's related, just let me know. I've heard two things about the piece rate. One, we want a general exemption for piece rate employees, farm workers. And then there was this discussion about a cultural exemption. And one is larger than the other. The full exemption is the recommendation or sentiment that if you are paid by piece rate, the minimum wage should not apply at all. What does the exemption mean?
I believe Eric and Holly that it would not be subject to minimum wage. Is that the exemption?
follow
And I
that.
think we laid it out pretty clearly in the presentation and the recommendation after that. As far as what we were thinking, yeah.
But then I don't understand what they were thinking.
The answer is yes. That's what they're proposing, is that if there were a piece rate exemption, then the state minimum wage would not.
So there would be no floor for workers.
That is what one suggestion is. I'm gonna just see if Senator Tipping, this is a clarifying question, and if it isn't, I might suggest that we move on, but you go ahead. You know, and I don't.
Well, to clarify, there was some mention of, hearing for the first time the unanimity around farmers already paying the minimum wage. And that is something that has been unanimous throughout this process, something that was asked of many of or all of the dozens of farmers that testified on this before the legislature. And that and the broader concerns about overtime is why we work to create a piece of legislation that is so narrow and small and a fraction of what was originally proposed. Just trying to clarify this concern about being employees. I mean, this is I think the confusion or the clarification that may have been, spread earlier in the process, in which I think we're, part of our process here needs to clarify. Was there any conversation of why people didn't understand that agriculture workers are already employees, or why they were led to believe that that would make it easier to implement overtime protections in the future? And what ways were members of the subcommittee and the chairs, did they clarify that information?
We primarily were inviting the ideas and comments and feedback of those who attended and did not particularly engage in, dialogue beyond if there was a clarifying question. So I think ultimately, with respect to the concept of this minimum wage and the exemption and subchapter 3, maybe this is my projection, Senator, but for an industry that has not been, aside from the reality that many laws do already apply to agricultural employers, they have been exempted from subchapter 3 for a very long time. That to be now subject to the definition of employee in and of itself was a drastic change, and therefore potentially portends other things that might come down later, despite legislation at the end of last session that was narrowly tailored.
Again, one last clarification. There was a mention that the concern that they would rather be under agriculture. I think Penny, you mentioned that. Can you explain a little bit more? Maybe that is part of the concern there. Is the idea you want to create some different minimum wage law that's not enforced by the Department of Labor?
I'm going to suggest that we hold that, because that will be, I think, a major part of our discussion afterwards. Like, how do you dice this? Is there another way other than subchapter 3 that appeals to this committee? And
well, I just on these concerns, was there a concern of enforcement of minimum wage by the Department of Labor? Or was there, a suggestion that it be enforced by the Department of Agriculture? Was that part of what was reported back?
No, there was none of that, but
Okay.
Sorry, Penny.
Thank you.
I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
My perspective is that all we're asking, and it's not about the Department of Labor enforcing whatever. I don't think that people are necessarily afraid of that. What I keep pushing is that let's pull it out and look at compensation strategies for agricultural workers, recognizing the dynamics of the industries. And it's not a, okay, let's just make this minimum wage. I think there's a bigger conversation that truly needs to happen at some point in time. I recognize we need to answer the governor's request, but I don't think that we should take a solution, put a solution in place that doesn't lead us in a direction that we would like to go eventually, which is compensation law as it relates to agriculture, recognizing the various dynamics of the industry. And that's a big undertaking.
I'm gonna move
Thank you.
us,
That's very helpful.
I'm gonna move us on to the second subcommittee report. And
Okay, so the farm worker subcommittee consisted of myself, Mike Boyer from Pine Tree Legal, and Juana Rodriguez from Mano and Mano. And we're going to divvy up the report back a little bit, but the main aspects we're going to cover are the process we used and how we reached out to farm workers, which differed considerably from the farm employer subcommittee process. And we're going to explain why we did it the way we did it. Then we're going to cover the key messages, in particular on whether a minimum wage should apply. If so, should it be any different? And what we learned about what workers were already earning. And then we're going to end by sharing a few stories and quotes from some of the workers. So I'm going to hand over to Mike and then to Juana to talk a little bit about the process.
Well, our task was to obtain as much input as we could from the farm workers in a way that maximized the opportunity for workers to come forward and speak. And so we decided, for reasons that Juana will explain shortly, that having large meetings at which farm workers would be invited to come and participate in a more public way was really not going to work, that there would be very little, if any, input gathered that way. And so we decided to use a number of other techniques, all of which the common theme was, instead of expecting workers to come to us in a more public way, we decided to go to the workers and talk to them, sometimes individually, sometimes in small groups, and sometimes with written. We also used a written survey, a very simple written survey that workers were able to fill out. More specifically, a couple of Fridays ago, all three of us were at a resource fair, which is an event which Juana's organization, Mano and Mano, sponsors during 2 or 3 of the different harvest seasons in Maine, where workers come, they can obtain basic necessities like food and clothing, speak to service providers, and have a lot of services provided all in one place. And those events tend to attract a pretty large number of workers. And we all attended one of them and spoke to several workers at that. Dr. Moyer Lee also went to several farms with Jorge Acero, one of the monitor advocate for Maine, and spoke to workers at a number of farms, spoke to them directly in small groups. We also had a phone conversation with a couple of workers that Pine Tree Legal represents, who had a fairly serious bad experience here in Maine, which is illustrative of one of the reasons why we need a minimum wage in Maine. And we also used the survey. And we were able to generate quite a bit of feedback from workers. Dr. Moyer Lee will share the specific results of that in a moment. But first, I'd like to ask if Juana could explain why it is we decided to do our work that way, rather than expect workers to come to us and speak publicly.
Yeah, I can share a little bit. So we have been working with a number of farm workers, doing some advocacy work and also providing services. And we knew that, like we have all seen throughout a lot of the processes, that farm workers haven't attended these meetings, or farm worker voices have not been present in this committee or in this process. So I think there was a number of reasons, one of them being that there is a fear of retaliation that workers could get from their employers if they come out and speak to someone about their situation, knowing that farm workers have very limited or no voice in some of play a role in some of what they are eligible to get paid or their if they're able to bargain together or that has all been completely shut down in the past. So they do know that. I think there was a fear of being retaliated and there's a fear of losing their job. There's a fear of them not being hired back if they're if someone spoke up to any concerns about work, that mean about minimum wage, housing, or whatever, any type of work issue. There's always that fear of them not being able to get hired back. So we did go with kind of different approach of like not holding a public meeting. We also know that farm workers are often managed by their employers of whether when they get out of work or where they can go. Some of them depend on employer transportation, so they know where they're going regardless of them telling them. So I think that was another thing of like, how can we speak with farm workers where they're in a safe space, where they're able to share what their concerns are openly with us without that fear of things happening. So that's why we took the approach we did. We did agree to confidentiality, completely measured confidential measures of like if we were talking to farm workers, what that meant for them, and what we were going to share back with the committee.
Okay, so just to cover some of the basic sort of statistics, if you will, of what this process bore out. So we had the one resource center visit that Mike mentioned. We spoke, we had a meeting with a couple workers. I conducted 6 farm visits with Jorge Acero, and we spoke with the workers as a group without the employer present. The employers were not present in any of the listening sessions we held. And we also had the survey, which covered the basic questions that the listening sessions on both sides were designed to get answers to. The survey was filled out by about 59 workers, and we spoke to around 73 workers. So there's considerable overlap between the workers who filled out the survey and those who spoke to us in person, but the overlap wasn't entire. So in total, we reached around 80 to 90 workers as part of these listening sessions in the past couple of weeks. That covered a range of crops, in particular veggies, apples, wild blueberries. Some of these workers, a very small number, were not currently working, but were former farm workers. And the workers had a number of different statuses. So a number of them were H-2A. Others were migrant or seasonal, but not H-2A. And then a number of them were also local workers, American-born local workers. So in terms of, to add the final bit of the process, is a number of people, say 3 or 4, either employers or representatives of organizations, contacted us and asked how a group of farm workers that either worked for them or that they were in touch with could get in touch with our subcommittee and share their input. Since we weren't announcing public meetings like the Farm Employer Subcommittee was doing. In each case, I sent an email with a blurb describing how to contact us, that they could share with the workers they were in touch with. In a few instances, we translated that into Spanish. I provided each of them with a copy of the survey and said they could distribute it and have the workers submit it anonymously. I provided my contact information so the workers could call me or email me or send messages to me on WhatsApp. And I offered to hold an ad hoc meeting as long as the employer wasn't present, either virtually or on the farm. None of those instances actually led to any further input from the workers, but I did want to share that aspect of the process, that anyone who got in touch asking how further workers could participate were offered an opportunity to share that back with the workers. In terms of the key messages, there were 3 key messages. One is there is overwhelming support for applying the state minimum wage to farm workers from the workers that we spoke to. And there is overwhelming support for enshrining that in law. The people we spoke to expressed no view on whether that should be enshrined in subchapter 3 or anywhere else. That didn't come up in our conversations. And the issue of a piece rate did come up. And in a number of conversations, because that has been part of the committee's discussions, I specifically put that issue to the workers. Some of the workers we spoke to are paid on a piece rate basis. Others are paid on an hourly basis. Not a single one expressed support for a different minimum wage for anyone who's paid on a piece rate basis. And in the survey responses, we had a 98% response rate in favor of applying the state minimum wage or a state minimum wage to farm workers. That represents a single dissenting response. In terms of the second message, one of our questions was, if you do believe a minimum wage should be applied to farm workers, should it be different in any way to the current state minimum wage? And that again reflects the discussions we've had in this committee about a possible exemption for piece rate work, about the uniqueness of agriculture and some of the themes that we've even touched on today. And in asking that question in the survey, we had a majority of farm workers answer yes, it should be different. They were all provided an opportunity to express how they thought it should be different. And the only view that was expressed is that it should be higher than the existing state minimum wage. In terms of the conversations we had with farm workers, there was pretty much universal support for the notion that a minimum wage for farm workers in state law should be higher than the existing state minimum wage. And interestingly, some of the reasons I think overlap with some of the other themes that we've discussed in this committee. So when they were asked why they thought it should be higher, there were, I'd say, 3 key messages that came out in response to that question. One was the hard and demanding physical labor that farm work involves. Many people commented that they thought farm work was more difficult, more physically demanding than other jobs, and they thought that a higher minimum wage should reflect that. The other one, or the second one, is the importance of agriculture and the importance of food. And a number of workers independently stressed that without farm workers, just like without farms, there is no food and no one could eat. It is an extremely important job. And they suggested that a higher minimum wage reflects the importance of farm work to society at large. And the third key theme that came out of the reasons for a higher minimum wage for farm work was to compensate for the general lack of benefits and other workers' rights that farm workers have. So one person, for example, suggested that there should be a higher minimum wage for farm work unless the farm employer provides health insurance. Another farm worker mentioned there should be a higher minimum wage for farm work because, and this wasn't to suggest this justifies it in their view, but they were just saying because they don't have collective bargaining rights or overtime rates. So the overtime that issue kind of came into those discussions in that way as well. So to compensate for the lack of benefits, which generally characterize the industry, and the lack of other employment rights, which are specifically excluded in law, a number of people thought there should be a higher minimum wage for farm workers. Now, the third key message was about what are people earning, and the majority of workers, the overwhelming majority of workers we spoke to or from whom we received results in the survey are indeed already earning above the state minimum wage of $13.80 an hour. But there were a small handful of people who were earning below it. So there's a couple workers that we spoke to that one is going to share a bit of their story afterwards, who were earning a couple dollars an hour below it. And there were a few survey responses that indicated that people were earning below the minimum wage. Now, to be completely transparent, we didn't try to do any calculation of the value of any housing that might have been offered. So, you know, if this were to, in a courtroom, an employer might say, you know, assessing the fair value of the housing, whatnot, so we didn't have the tools or capacity to do that. So I put that out there to have a complete picture, but there are a number of people who did say that they're receiving less than $13.80 an hour. The median rate that was answered on the survey, we asked everyone in the survey, what is their hourly rate? A number of people didn't answer if they were paid on a piece rate basis. A number of them opted not to answer. So of those that did answer, the median rate was $17 an hour. And to get to the question, at least in part, as it was relevant to our subcommittee, about why is this needed? I think the closest we came to that was that some of the answers that the workers provided in the survey as to why they think the state minimum wage or a minimum wage should be extended to farm workers. A number of them stressed the idea of fairness. A number of them stressed the idea of equality with other workers, that other workers are entitled to it. So I suppose you could say that's a symbolic value to some of them if they're already earning above the state minimum wage. And some of them mentioned that there would be a direct benefit to them, in particular those who are earning below the minimum wage. So that's the overview of the key messages. I'm going to hand over to Juana to share one story, and then I'll close out with a few quotes from farm workers.
Yeah, so I'm gonna share a story that we spoke with 2 farm workers that were getting below the minimum wage. They were getting I believe it was $11.25 an hour. And they asked for a 25-cent raise to their employer. And their employer got mad at them and violently attacked them for asking for a 25 raise minimum wage, and eventually fired them without paying them what they owed for the wages. They did express that they were in employer housing. And the employer, when they asked for the minimum with the raise, came in and did a number of things. One of them was they were eating, and then the employer spilled their drinks all over their food and on their table. They also grabbed them by the neck. They also took their phone and threw it multiple times violently. So they ended up leaving, and they wanted us to share their story because they know this happens to a lot of farm workers that don't always have the opportunity to speak up. And they want those protections for those farm workers that we expressed. Most of them are getting above the minimum wage, and but there are some that aren't, and those are the ones we often don't hear from. So they wanted us to share this with you all, so that you know there are people out there that are not making the minimum wage, and there are some employers that don't treat their workers the way we should.
Okay, and I'll just end by reading a series of very short quotes without any commentary. These are quotes that came in on the survey because a number of the questions were open-ended. And I think it's helpful to shed some light, beyond what the statistics and the key messages tell us. It's helpful to shed some light on some of the farm workers' views on these issues. So farm workers do the hardest work. Without them, there is no food on the table. Next quote, yes, minimum wage will highly help me and my family. Just traveling back home consumes much of our salary. Farm workers should be treated like any other worker. They work hard, long days to feed the need. Piece rate can work for some farms, but employers should supplement if not meeting minimum wage. Having a minimum wage is more ethical than allowing farm workers to be exploited. I am paid more because the farm I work for believe in our value as an integral part to the success of their farm. I think a higher minimum wage can attract more workers to an industry that typically struggles with finding help. Farm work can exist in a world where people are paid a living wage. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm gonna ask if there are clarifying questions, not statements with a question mark at the end. Anything that you'd like to clarify from what you heard?
I have just a quick question. Geographically, were you able to cover farm workers throughout the whole state? Just like the kept in the county?
We did not make it to the county.
Okay.
We covered a bit of a range. I felt like I was in the car quite a bit over the past couple of weeks, but I didn't make it up to the county. No.
Okay.
So then
No,
what
Penny.
oh, sorry, go, Penny, go ahead.
I did want to add to
Oh,
that, we did
hold on.
mention that there are some farm workers in the county that probably have left just due to the seasonality, so but I know there are still a few around.
I just didn't know if, like, the potato industry, because you mentioned blueberries, dairy, but I didn't hear potato industry, and of course, the bulk of that is in the county. So that was why I'm asking.
Question, Penny?
Yeah, just a couple of clarifying questions. Do you have a feel for of the number of employees? I think you said you had 80 to 90. How many of those might have been H2A? And do you have a feel for the size of the farms that just relatively speaking, the size of the farms that the employees may have been representing? And do you have a feel for how many of the entities, the farms may have been year-round operations, such as dairy or some other industry? And do you have a feel for the region or of the state that the employees represented?
Okay, so on H2A, I don't have the answer to that for the surveys because that wasn't one of our survey questions and they were entirely anonymous. In terms of the farm visits, I don't have the breakdown in front of me, but we did take a note of the breakdown. I think it was probably a little bit more than half were H2A, but I'd be happy to circulate the exact numbers afterwards. The size of the farms, again, that wasn't a survey question, so I can't tell you in terms of those workers who filled out the survey. In terms of the farms we visited, I think there was quite a range. We did visit some farms where most of the workers were no longer there, and we spoke to a small group of workers. And we spoke to some farms where there was a smaller group, you know, in the region of 10 to 15 farm workers. In terms of year-round, I would say, I think most of the farms we spoke to had some year-round operations, but a very small sort of skeleton staff, if you will, and the bulk of it was seasonal. In the region, we don't really want to go into too much depth about where we were, but if the point of the question is, did we do a sort of representative survey of the state of Maine? No, we did not. We didn't have the resources or the time to sort of do a representative survey of all the different counties in Maine. Didn't make it up to the county, for example.
So I'm going to suggest a couple of things. We have handouts so that you have them as resources for the rest of the meeting. So I want to hand those out. I want to give us a 5-minute break just to reset. Bathrooms are at the end of the hall on the left. And what I want you to be thinking about during those 5 minutes is that we're going to pivot here and be thinking about, you know, is there anything that you heard that you can find the through line where you can imagine all of you in the room would agree to it? And if and I don't want to just move on quickly from there because that's where I'd really like us to sit for a while. But if you are completely stumped on that point, then I want to start getting down what are some potential building blocks, even if you think not everybody in the room would agree with it, but there might be a large contingent of this committee that could agree to it. So that we start building like the architecture of what a law could look like. So we'll take a break. When you're back, there'll be handouts in front of you and we'll email those out to, actually, could we email these out to the groups? Yeah, so For the committee members on the line, we will email these these subcommittee reports out to you right now so that you have that as well and can participate in the discussion. So we'll be back at 2:23. Yeah, she says me about
Thanks.
Yeah, I
Oh,
need
that's
to
good.
figure that out too, I'm like. But I appreciate the opportunity to share knowledge, I mean, I think it'll be more.
When you're done, I want to take. Two people.
Sure.
It's just, I'll come back.
Sure.
An hour more feels.
Yeah.
I'm sure you feel the same way.
All right. Just gonna get some fresh air.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you something, Dylan, but
What's that?
I don't know.
Oh.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you something, but.
Oh, words.
For those on the line, on Zoom, we're gonna get started in just a minute. Dylan, could you show the participants for a moment, just so I can see hands raised? I just want to get a sense, not chat, yeah. For those who are hearing, could I just see a show of hands for individuals who will likely want to make a public comment? Not a super reliable question because we might not be back on yet, but. Okay, great, thank you. All right, we're still waiting on nobody? Nobody? Okay, all right, so, given the number of, individuals who we think are gonna wanna make public comment, it's not a lot, so, what I'd suggest is that we go until 3:05 for our discussion, that we have public input from 3:05 to 3:15, and that we, tend to these housekeeping issues from 3:15 to 3:30. You all have the handouts now in front of you of the key themes surfaced at both subcommittee listening opportunities. And really the question on the table now is, did you hear anything? You can get rid of the participants now, thank you. Did you hear is there an element that you heard that you think could be a through line that could form the basis of legislation? And I particularly want to suggest that you think about what you heard from the perspective that you don't represent in the room. Penny, you go ahead.
I've never formed legislation, so bear with me. But I think one of the things that I heard from the employee group is a similar message that the employers have, that agriculture is different, that their compensation maybe should be looked at differently, that their hourly rate maybe should be different from the standard. I'm not saying that the employers said that, but the employees are saying a similar message that agriculture is different. And so we should look at, it suggests that we look at compensation for agricultural employees outside of the mainstream compensation laws. I heard that message, and maybe I wanted to hear it, but I think that's what I heard several times.
Thank you. I'll get that down in shorthand in just a second, but either reactions to that or additions that are different than that.
I think that the way that it's different, I think, from the farm workers' perspective, as we heard reported back, is that the minimum wage should be higher. So I would agree with Penny if that were her assertion. I'm assuming it's not, but that's what I was hearing in terms of how it should be, the specific way in which it should be different.
So I'm gonna first say sort of minimum wage handled differently. And then I'm not going to suggest that you all are in agreement about higher, but that is sort of one branch here. There are other branches in which it was suggested that that payment be handled differently, I guess I should say. Go ahead, Tom.
Back to your question about 3 points.
Yeah.
One that I've heard here today, and I think heard over the last 5 years when we're having testimony on these things, people keep saying to the employers, we pay minimum wage or higher. And from that, I hear, one, because people deserve that. And two, because if I don't, I'm not going to have the ability to attract the type of worker that I need and want to make my operation work smoothly. So there seems to be agreement on paying the minimum wage.
Anybody disagree with that? I heard that too, but just testing here. Other thoughts?
I think there's universal agreement on the notion that there are larger issues at play for farmers. And I come squarely at this from the worker perspective and feel deep allegiance, solidarity, sympathy with the dynamics that are hitting small farmers in this economy. And so I don't quite know how that forms the basis of a through line for the narrow charge of our piece of legislation, but it feels like there's a lot of potential. I think the language from Nancy was like other policies and societal support. So I just think there's potential work for us perhaps to do. Maybe it's not our charge or jurisdiction, but to think about what are the other dimensions of this that we can think about, act on together, advocate for, put forward, that are adjacent to this narrow charge around minimum wage. And the same is obviously true for farm workers, like larger issues at play about why people are in motion and migration all over the world, et cetera. So.
Anything else? And
Penny, did you have your?
no, did you take 10% here?
Oh,
Yeah, I had wanted to kind of echo Tom's point, and it's like any other industry, we're driven by availability of skilled resources, and we choose to compensate them based on that skill set. And so I just wanted to echo, like any other industry, we seek skilled resources and are willing to pay based on that skill set.
If this is the full extent, and I'm not necessarily saying that it is, but if it is, I think one possibility would be to start articulating approaches, even if you don't think that they would achieve unanimous support, just to start understanding what some of the options to, if you use, go back to the executive order, here's what's being asked of you. To develop legislation for introduction in the second session that will implement a minimum wage for agricultural workers. So if that's the mandate, there's clearly multiple ways of doing that. One's the most obvious, so I'm gonna start us out by just putting that on the table because it was the basis of the original bill, right? So one is subchapter 3. That ends up being 3 elements: minimum wage, the issue of mandatory overtime, and rest breaks. Do I have this right? Those were sort of that's what distinguishes. Not everybody agrees with that, obviously, but what are other options? Go ahead, Tom.
I would just put on rest breaks that they're unpaid. So, and you don't have to take them.
Offered, West Bake's offered. Yeah, thanks.
Penny?
I'm going to say that the option 2, I was going to make it option 1, but you took that already, so. Option 2 is to create an agricultural compensation laws that address the minimum wage, which to me is what's in the executive order, correct? Correct? That's it. Correct?
Minimum wage, yes.
So then, as part of that same bill, I would propose that a group of farmers and farm workers come together to develop compensation and labor laws for agriculture that recognizes the diversity of the industry.
Can you be any more specific than that?
Then the diversity of the industry?
Yeah, like how you would how you're imagining different elements of the ag industry paying people differently.
I would say that there is a significant amount of work that I have a little document, somewhere. But basically, one of the things that we have talked about a lot is that there are seasonal farms and there are year-round farms that have seasonal employees. And there are also non-seasonal workers. You also have an year-round operations such, and I'll use dairy as the example. We have blueberry that is a tight time frame. You have, and I'll use operations like mine that is a vegetable, mid-sized vegetable farm that has seasonal elements from a worker perspective and has year-round workers as well as year-round work in essence. I think that what we need to do is take and create and slice the industries, the different components of it, and look at how compensation would be addressed based on the intersection of certain things, like crops that take 3.5 weeks to harvest, crops that are extremely time sensitive versus crops such as a carrot going to be in the ground for a period of time. Those are all of the things that happen on a farm that if you look at the intersections of seasonality of product, seasonal farms, year-round operations, and what are the product types, not at a minutia level, but a fairly high level, and say, how does compensation get crafted differently based on these intersections?
Thank you. Other ideas?
I was just gonna ask a clarifying question for Penny. The bit you mentioned about the agricultural workers and employers coming together to design this, if I heard that right. Did you have in mind like an institutional setup, like the members of a board that kind of issues what the wage rate is, or I just wonder if you could just flesh that bit out a bit?
In my opinion, which I've said this for probably the last 1.5 years, is that we need an external facilitator to end a process, somebody who's experienced in process of bringing, I would say, what can be considered complex issues and distilling it into its component parts. And I would say that somehow we need to get the workers at the table and the farmers at the table and get the groups. They can participate, but I think we need the boots on the ground doing this. But you also need experts in policy development. So I would say that we need to come up with a list of representatives from each of the industry types. How many people, how would we break this apart? I mean, when I think about the work that we did on ending hunger by 2030, it was a large group of people that made that happen, and it was orchestrated in a very, I think, a very good way. I think we need to take the same type of approach if we're going to truly address compensation and labor laws as they relate to agriculture. I don't know if that answers your question, but in my head, I can see how something like this could happen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Yeah, Matt.
I mean, just in the spirit of putting options on the table, I mean, what Penny, one version of what Penny is naming, which is used all over the world in different places, is like called sectoral bargaining, essentially, where you have a tripartite structure, farm workers, farmers, the state, and then industry by industry, you set minimum standards. And part of the logic of that is to, in essence, try and take wages out of competition. So that feels complicated, that feels, but it just in the spirit of naming models and options, that is I don't know, I don't want to, that's one cut of what is being named there. And you see that happening in different states with nursing home workers, with fast food workers, where there's an idea to create a floor and have some flexibility sector by sector or crop by crop within it. Again, not in the spirit of putting options on the table.
Thank you. Well, so to continue with more, go ahead, Eric. Eric, muted. You're muted.
Oh, thank you, sorry. So I guess I would suggest as another option, we give ag workers minimum wage under MRS Title 26, Section 664, which is what I recommended during the presentation a couple weeks ago. And as part of that, we build in a piece rate exemption. As part of that, we build in a youth wage exemption. And I guess that's it.
Is this subchapter 3? Yeah. Others, thank you, Eric. What else have we heard?
Well, I think a lot of what I heard was that a lot of them were okay with paying the minimum wage, but it's that subchapter 3. So an option to put in there for the minimum wage portion of it, the compensation portion of it, but still have the exemption in the rest of those for the subchapter 3. As well, I know that we have other ag sectors that have that youth training wage that's pretty important to be able to have kind of a training wage for the youth as well as that piece rate. Not sure how that could be built in. The potato industry doesn't have a piece rate, so I can't speak to that, but
exemption for mandatory overtime, the mandatory
subchapter 3, like if there's a way to word it to put in there for the minimum wage, but keep it ag separate from those other laws.
Jeannie, under section 664, if we did it that way, we would not, what I'm trying to suggest is we would not be removing the current exemption.
Okay,
zero, sub chapter 3 on that. Section 664, which is in the subchapter 3. There's a number of sections within subchapter 3.
Do I get rid of this? Sorry, there. Okay. Is this different than that?
Yes. I think, right, there's two distinct things that were offered. One is sub 3 with carve outs, which is Eric's proposal, right? And then what I heard you saying is apply the minimum wage, presumably not in sub 3, but do not apply the first, the 3 provisions that you put up top, mandatory overtime, rest breaks.
In which case it wouldn't be in subchapter 3.
Minimum wage, but no adjacent provision.
I think we're maybe conflating subchapter 3 as being the indicator of whether or not we remove the exemption. But I think what we're really talking about here is removing or not the exemption that applies to ag workers. Is that right?
I'm not gonna try to answer that.
Let me ask a question that might clarify it. So the exemption that exists now that is in subchapter 3 is in the definitions section, right? It's in 663. So it sounds to me like what you're suggesting, Eric, and maybe also Jeannie, is to leave that exemption in the definition section, but create sort of a separate, I suppose there's 2 different things. So Eric's version would be to create a separate entitlement to minimum wage with some other pieces with the youth rate and the piece rate carve out within 664. So that would be maintaining the exemption, but then adding a sort of separate entitlement in 664. And it sounds like what Jeannie is suggesting is sort of leaving subchapter 3 completely alone, but doing something sort of similar to what Eric is suggesting somewhere else in chapter 7. Sound accurate?
I don't know all the chapters like
Well,
you do,
right,
but yes,
but
something
elsewhere
like that.
within Title
Yes.
36, so you're not suggesting putting it somewhere other than under the sort of DOL purview, right?
Right.
Neither
No.
of you is suggesting that, I think, right? It
And
doesn't really matter where.
create a separate entitlement to minimum wage within 664, that's Eric. Jeannie, leave subchapter 3 alone, but do this elsewhere, somewhere else within Title 26.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't have to decide exactly
just-
where necessarily, but I think that's the distinction between those 2.
I don't know who should we say, every history. Bill, something, history. And this is Matt, your version of that, sort of, not that you're stating it, but not advocating for it. Yeah, got it. Other iterations. One, 3, 4, and 5 clearly meet the requirements of the executive order. It is unclear to me whether Penny's does. It could, or it might not. And unless that were fleshed out significantly further, it doesn't currently meet the requirement of the executive order, just to be clear about that. Other variations on the theme. Senator Tipping.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not able to see the board and follow which ones are which numbers.
Or
Were
sorry,
you saying that the piecework rate exemption would meet the requirements of the executive order?
yeah, don't quote me on that. That's a good point.
I mean, my understanding is that would mean there would be no minimum. And more work could go to piecework to get rid of it. So I feel like that would not meet the requirements.
Others' thoughts on that? Parts of it would and parts of it might not, but could, Tom?
And this might be confusion on my part, but I thought we were looking for common threads that might bring consensus.
Ideally, yes.
Okay. So I just want to say from this person's perspective, those do not. If we are taking, I mean, I've heard the Department of Labor, and I don't want to speak for them, they can tell me I'm wrong, but I've heard them being resistant to a youth wage rate generally, not just in agriculture, but in general. And to Senator Tipping's point, exempting piece rate from the minimum wage means there is no state minimum wage for anybody engaged in piece work. Whether or not that is consistent with the executive order, I think can be debated. It's not consistent with anything I would ever agree to. And I just want to put that out
Sure.
there.
Yep, no, I appreciate that. Let me take Eric, because I suspect you'll want to be responding to that directly.
Got a couple of things, and one is I recently stumbled across a report for the Maine Technology Institute, and I think maybe just to kind of level set a little bit and let folks get an insight maybe into where the ag entities are coming on all this. And I could share this document if you all would like, but MTI found that farmers, ranchers, and other ag managers were paid on average $14.23. And farm workers and laborers were paid on average $15.57. This is July 2023. So over $1 more farm workers on average are making than farmers based on this survey. And so this is just where this is coming from. And this points to the fact that, you know, farming is not profitable. I think we all agree that there needs to be more money in agriculture. And if we could find a way to do that, I think we'd be well ahead of the curve. And then to your point, Tom, I think the governor charged us with finding a way that this would work for all players. And, you know, putting making ag workers, you know, setting the state minimum as the minimum for ag workers, but giving a couple of exemptions to me is a way that would make it work and make potentially all players agree to it. And I think that would be meeting, you know, be up to the governor ultimately if she agreed with that, of course. But I would think we would be meeting the executive order with that, what I put forward, or some iteration of it. And then a question for all of you: if what I just said for piece rate would not be acceptable to all of you, is there another version of piece rate that might work for everybody around the table to consider what we put forward about piece rate in our industry?
Senator Tipping, is your hand up again or from previously?
Well, just on that, I mean, I'd say the administration's been very clear in their definitions on that with regard to other industries that have talked about piece rate and youth wage and all those pieces. You know, it's also been a core part, obviously, of the conversation about the minimum wage and textile work in canneries in Maine, and you know, going back 100 years here with what a minimum wage means and what it does. But more broadly, and just trying to be constructive on these and offer some items here. I did ask a couple meetings ago if the governor's support extended to those other pieces of the bill as proposed. So the voluntary breaks and the limit on mandatory overtime. I was wondering if there had been a chance to clarify that and if that was also an area of support that we should make sure is included. And then just to Penny's point, I just want to note that at this point, you know, if workers did engage in that kind of process and spoke out, you know, with others and tried to negotiate rates, they could face backlash and could be fired and retaliated against without protections. And so perhaps as one of these plans, or in addition to any of them, a consideration for workers being able to engage in that kind of process that she describes with protections for that kind of concerted activity.
I do not have an update for your specific questions, Senator Tipping, relative to those narrow questions of support by the governor, that's certainly something that we could continue to ask for some clarity on.
Thank you.
I mentioned Heather Spalding had put a message in chat that I have here.
Please.
So Heather says, I would like to see the same bill that was significantly amended and voted through the House and Senate. So no piece rate exemption, no youth rate exemption, work beyond 160 hours in a 2-week period should not be mandatory. The mentions the rest break piece as well. I mean, just the bill that was towards the end of the last session.
Thank you. I think one of the reasons I wanted to press on this, which we're calling number 4, which is the Title 26, basically a piece rate and a youth rate exemption. The only reason I'm pressing on this to try to get more perspectives from you all on this is that it was a large topic of conversation over the last 3 months. Yeah, I feel like it was new information that you all received, or some of you received, and it felt like new information. And if it's a non-starter for X number of people in the room, I completely respect that. And I just, you know, unlike, I don't want to discount what you said about a couple of potato farmers having some concern, particularly this season, about the mandatory overtime piece in order to get the potato crop in. But that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that felt like a less significant concern than the body of individuals that we heard from about this issue. And that's the only reason I'm dwelling on it. Did you have?
I would just suggest, and I'm very sympathetic to the situation that arose. We had a 2-week period to harvest. But I think there's a way to deal with that without totally writing it out of the law, but to establish an exception. And the words are not coming to my head at this point, but I don't like making the exception the rule. It's not every year that you have a 2-week period, right? You said this was a sort of a year from hell in terms of
The whole growing season,
Right.
I think everybody had weather from,
right.
Yeah.
And I don't want that to form the basis of policy as.
Well, I think that
rather than creating an exception to address that when it occurs.
Yeah.
right. Well, I think though, for the mandatory overtime, that's a huge concern for the potato industry every year. This year was just the poster child that kind of really pinpointed that, you know, and put it right down to 2 weeks, but that mandatory overtime is a huge concern for the potato industry regardless. Yeah.
And the mandatory overtime is 160 hours in 2 weeks. So that means
Well,
people are working over 80 hours a week to go
Yeah.
over.
Did you have?
Yeah, I'm curious, is there any way of demonstrating how much, like how many hours employers paid their workers during that 2-week period? I just feel like it would be a useful piece.
That might be something I can look into getting. Depends on how quickly we need that information, I guess. I just know that when this all started, I put out a survey to all of my growers. And probably 75 to 80% of them got back to me on that survey. And that is a huge concern in the potato industry, is that limit on overtime because of the uniqueness, the growing season, and it's only certain times of the year. It's not like we're making, you know what I mean? It's a 52 weeks out of the year this is happening, but there's 2 key parts of our industry, or times in our industry, which is planting and harvest, that's a huge concern. Primarily more harvest, just because we're up against the weather, winter coming, and trying to get those crops into the ground as quickly as possible.
Eric?
Thanks. The mandatory overtime piece that would come with removing the exemption is not just, it also is a concern for our producers. And my intention in what I suggested, and I guess a question for the AG representative, if we did my recommendation, my understanding is that the mandatory overtime also would not be part of that for ag workers either. Can you
Correct.
confirm that?
Yeah,
Okay.
so the way that mandatory overtime becomes applicable is if that exemption that is in, that currently exists in section 663, if that is removed, the definition of employee in mandatory, limits on mandatory overtime is borrowed from that. So if that doesn't change, then the definition that is currently in place stays the same for limits on mandatory overtime. You're correct, is what I'm saying.
Option 4 is all of the exemptions.
Uh,
Is that accurate?
I can't answer that. I can rewrite any of these to be clearer. With direction.
I suppose that's a way of saying it. I'm not sure all of the exemptions is necessary. I think that's. It's maintaining existing exemptions and creating some addition. As I understand it.
So for, I'll just put you on the spot, and if we needed you to flesh out what this actually looked like, do you have enough information that you could do that?
I don't know, because I think that the reason that the original version, I think, removed the exemption is because the exemption applies to the entirety of subchapter 3. And so if you keep the exemption in, and then you want to create additional exemptions and then additional entitlements, all within 664, you would still have some things that didn't apply. The main one would be record keeping. And so, and enforcement is the other one that you would have. So you'd have to try to flesh out. You might end up sort of having to repeat a lot of stuff in 664 that is already exists elsewhere in subchapter 3, but not 664 specifically.
Yeah, thank you. Matt?
Three sort of general comments. One, I think we've actually done some really helpful work here. We've narrowed the area of disagreement, right? Which is not to like sugarcoat that, like what's to come is much more difficult, but we've narrowed it to essentially where a minimum wage should live, and then these questions of whether there are carve-outs and whether the other provisions apply. And we should all just like mull on that. My sense is that at the end of the day, you sort of stand where you sit on these things a little bit, and it's going to be very, very hard, to like, I understand why like certain farmers want mandatory overtime provisions not to apply, or, youth exemptions. I get that. And that like gonna be I can't imagine us going there, but just to say that, I think like we've made progress and the miles ahead are harder. 2, I think on forced overtime, just to sort of like put more in the stew for like from all perspectives. Employment law is inherently about trying to strike some balance between the worker and the employer. That provision in law comes out of a CMP line worker, Brett Churchill, getting electrocuted because he was working forced overtime to the point where he like literally couldn't keep his eyes open. And so there's like a dimension of workplace safety in there. And obviously, electric utilities are different from potato farms, but workers aren't property. Like we deserve some control over our lives, and having that voluntary overtime, like after 160 hours in a 2-week period, is important from a worker perspective and the safety provisions. And then the third point is I just want us to keep in mind that there is a danger and a downside to exemptions and carve-outs. And the reason we are having this conversation right now, essentially like a century after this was put in place, was because certain people and certain workers were carved out originally. And that has a whole history, and we don't need to relitigate it, and none of us were responsible for its doing. But it's just, it's like, I just really want us to wrestle with that and wrestle with the like, could we actually not carve people out and be okay? And just think together about that question, recognizing like the scary, the stats Eric shared and the reality of people paying their workers before they pay themselves and all that.
Thank you. I'm gonna, because of what time it is, move us along, but what I wanted to suggest is that well, hold on, just give me 1 second here. Let's move to public comment. Let's move to public comment, and then we're gonna come back to this in a second. So Dylan, if you don't mind taking a look at who's raised their hand, and then we'll circle back.
Yeah, it looks like Senator Timberlake.
Yes, Senator Timberlake, go ahead.
I'm working on it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I find it an interesting afternoon in my life. I played about 10 hands of solitaire while I sat here. Tried to decide whether I needed counseling or not when I got done. But I think that when I listen to what it's all about, I think there's some ground to be made. I think we all have to give and take a little. As somebody who served 14 years in the legislature and been on both sides of all these issues, I think that what I heard is that the farmers pretty adamantly want to be kept out of the labor section of the law and be put in their own section 26. But I think that what I feel is, you really heard is the piecework and the youth wage is something that, I've talked about for a long time. And, and you listen to what was being said from the farm workers. Well, without us, they don't, the people don't get to eat. Well, what you got to remember about farmers in Maine, we're at the end of the food chain and we're at the end of the island. We're on the island. And if you put us too far off the island, the rest of the United States and the world doesn't do business with us. And we don't have the options that I wish that we have. I mean, our own family farm is going to have a long conversation this year after the horrible year we've had this year with weather and everything else, of whether we don't take out another 20 or 30 acres, 20 or 30% of our farm to get it down so that just family members can operate it. And if you're not careful, that's what you're going to do with farming. I know a whole bunch of you never liked DeCoster egg farms in Turner, but it was taken over by Hillendale and some others. And within the next year, that farm's going to be totally gone. And again, it was drove out because Maine's on an island and we're not close enough to New York and we're not close enough to Boston that they can raise eggs cheaper in Connecticut, believe it or not, than what they can in Maine. And as was said in the beginning, we are receivers of whatever Hannaford, Walmart, all these places want to give us. We don't get to set the price of what we want. For instance, the Honeycrisp apples we were selling at the beginning of the season, we were selling them for $65 a box, has now dropped to $52 a box in the last 2 weeks. And name me anything else out there in the world that the price has gone down. I know my grocery bill when I go to the store, my gas bill when I buy gas, or anything else has not dropped. So I think you guys are now thinking. I think that you could get some buy-in on the minimum wage, but you're going to have to give some concessions on the youth wage and the piecework along the way. And I think there is an avenue if everybody keeps their mind open. I don't know what it is today. There's nothing that I would agree to today that I've heard from what's out there, but I think it can be done. But I just want you to all remember that there's not a lot of farmers in Maine that are getting rich. Most of us are struggling on, just barely holding on. And I really do want to continue farming in Maine. I love it. I know the families around me in my local community love it. And I just hope that we don't push another portion. We don't got many portions left to push out. So I'm gonna leave you at that. I just, I've listened to every single meeting, been to every single thing you guys done. I'll be there in the end, and I'm gonna get to vote on it at the end of the day. But I do think this needs some work, and I think that you're at least talking about it. So I thank you all for your participation, and just know that I'm always setting out here, Mr. Tipping.
Thank you, Senator.
Because I like Mike a lot, so we sat beside each other.
That's a comforting thought, Senator Timberlake.
You guys have a good day.
Thank you. We have Nolan Thompson. Go ahead, Nolan.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I keep hearing something and I just wanted to kind of get a better sense of it. But overtime, 180 hours, and then there's overtime, isn't it? Overtime after 41 hours in a week. So I'm confused. How do you get, like, who can work 180 hours in 2 weeks? That's every day at like 11 hours a day. And I know somebody mentioned health or safety, but it just, I mean, it sounds, everybody's talking about like it's just normal, but it's kind of blowing my mind to think about it like that. So can somebody explain that?
We're just going to take public comment now, rather than engage in conversation, but are there other remarks that you'd like to share?
Well, I guess just simply that it's been good listening in on the meetings, and the range of ideas that people have had have been encouraging. It seems like a lot of stones that keep being overturned to get comments out and get ideas out and to address the issue. So that would be a comment.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Was there a third individual, Dylan?
There was a third individual who is now.
Go, Julianne, go right ahead.
There's a couple more now.
Did we lose her?
Well, no, we didn't, but her hand went down. Let me see if I can, okay.
Julianne, if you wanted to, you go ahead if you wanted to.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Well, first I wanted to thank all of you for the incredible work that you have done on the larger committee and the subcommittees. I know that that's a tremendous amount of time that everyone had to invest. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Maine Farmers Coalition, a newly formed organization of some of the larger farm employers in the state of Maine. And I will say that we were one of the groups that reached out in concern that a lot of our farm workers were not able to participate in the subcommittee process. And we were given the opportunity on Thursday night to then have a couple days to round up workers and provide information to them to participate. It really was not enough time. I wish that we had had that information provided to us much earlier in the process so that all farm workers that wanted to participate could have done so. I also spoke with a lot of farmers who were not aware of the listening sessions. So while I think an incredible amount of participation was able to happen, there's still a lot of farmers and farm workers that were left out of the process, and a lot of information that was left out as well. One of the things that struck me while during the conversation today was that there was no mention that agriculture is the only employer workers under the age of 14 are allowed to work. And so when we're talking about minimum wage for youth workers, I think there's a significant difference between a 10-year-old worker and a 17-year-old worker that does deserve significant conversation. So it was just one of the issues that I wanted.
broke up a little bit. Julie, we lost you right at the end there. But I think we got the rest of your, I think we got the last of your comment. If there was more, just raise your hand again, if you're hearing us, because we stopped hearing you right at the end there. So then why don't we pivot to sort of what's next? We have a meeting on the 27th of November. That was intended to be our last meeting, and before you leave, Matt, just know that we're trying to grab you for one additional meeting.
Great.
On exactly 2 weeks after November 27th.
The 11th.
The 11th
I have
of
it on the
December,
calendar for some reason.
1 to 4, 1 to 4 in person. So the thinking here, if it works for folks, is that at the next meeting, we would ask you if you feel like you can add more nuance to any one of these ideas that either you proposed or that you think might be a reasonable idea, to put more flesh on the bones, because next meeting is really all about what could these look like? How do we get to actual, if not specific bill language, then bill structure. And so we basically want you to bring all of your good thoughts to that next meeting, so that we could then, as a planning team, take that information, try and get it down in writing in a coherent manner, so that on the final meeting, you're given these, X number of distinct options. You may decide at the end of the day that you can't come to consensus on any one of them. And it won't shock me if that's the case, but if we're able to, great. If not, then the co-chairs, Nancy and Commissioner Fortman, will have the authority to kind of decide how to present that to the governor. It could very well be that they have a distinct recommendation based on one of these, given the feedback that they've gotten from all of you. I suspect, although I won't speak for them, that even if they did have a distinct recommendation that they think this is the best path forward, that there would be reference in the report as to the other ideas floated. So there would be transparency in that way. But basically, the 27th is the time to offer specifics, bring recommendations as specifically as possible to this meeting on how best to provide minimum wage to ag workers. What we can do, if it's helpful to you, is get this list out in abbreviated form as quickly as possible, so that you see what the architecture is that you've come up with so far. If you have a sixth brilliant idea after this meeting, by all means, don't be constrained by these 5. But we felt like by having one additional meeting, next meeting could be devoted to the hashing out of the more specifics, and then the final meeting is you've been given in that meeting packet some more kind of clear write-up of those options. Does the process make sense? Do you have questions about that, concerns about it?
Didn't want to rush at the very end. That's why we got the green light, the green light to go past the executive order, December 1st timeframe. We just did not want to, go full screech mode. We wanted to give ourselves a little bit more time.
So, and then we will have a final report to the governor before the end of the year. So, between December 11th and December 31st, we would turn this into a final report, which is essentially just going to be a report out of what happened at each meeting and what the outcomes were. Not new text that, will be of any surprise to any of you. So I think that, and we do have a meeting location, just so you know, December 11th, 1 to 4. We'll put this in the note that we send out with this summary of the 5 options that have been articulated so far. It will be at the Department of Labor's Safety Works room, which is their building is at 45 Commerce Drive. Things I've forgotten, questions you have about process?
Sorry, did you already said that 2 weeks from now, are we here?
2 weeks from now, where are we? 2 weeks from now?
Like the Deering building, is that the meeting?
Give me a second. Yeah, Deering 101, which is a great room, and it's on Blossom Lane. It's a Department of Agriculture building, and it's off of Blossom Lane, 32 Blossom Lane. Yeah, across the river. So we'll get that out in the meeting notice as well. Location, 5 options. And then the information on December 11th. How's that going? How's that?
I have a question around the 5 options and the opportunity to get public input. I don't want to bog down our process too much, but I do just want to respect that folks who either participated in the listening sessions or who may be interested in this topic more generally may want to have an opportunity to react to something a bit more concrete than just like, share your thoughts here or 3 general questions. So I wonder if that's been discussed or if that could be considered as something that happens as we hear the end.
I mean, I have one thought, but I don't know if it's a great thought. One is that we intentionally extended the next 2 meetings to be 3 hours rather than 2.5, or we've had online meetings being 2 hours. We've had in-person meetings being 2.5. I think that's how it's gone. And we're having both of the next 2 meetings be 3-hour meetings so that there's an opportunity for more dialogue, frankly, but it could also be an opportunity for greater public input, more time, I guess I should say, allotted to public input. Given the time constraint that we're under, I don't personally see a way to sort of hold a public hearing, if you will, or the equivalent of that, but there certainly is that opportunity at every meeting. So one idea would be to make sure that you share the dates of those meetings with your constituents.
I was just gonna add to that, that the idea of the next 2 sessions is we're heading in a more narrow direction. So today we had kind of a free-flowing conversation. Next session ideally would be a bit narrower, and the session after that will be even narrower. And then whatever goes to the legislature, there'll be opportunity there for public engagement and comment and whatnot as well.
Not perfect, but it's a process. Okay. Oh, yeah.
I have a thought in regards also to like that I think and the opportunity to offer a 6-1 if possible. And I don't have a 6-1 right now, but like just thinking about the farmer case, like how is it reflected in the options? Like what farmers stated. I think we talked about a lot about like what owners want and what they want to see, but also I feel like there's a missing of like what we heard from the farm workers and what they also want to see in this. And I don't know if this is like, just to me, I don't know if it's actually reflected in like any of these options. Besides like, yeah, they want minimum wage or higher, which that wasn't an option.
Yeah. So we have 6 options here that we can bring any kind of nuance to at the next meeting or more if you come up with additional ones after today. Okay, so I think our charge is clear to get information back out to you as quickly as possible. And if you have questions about process, don't hesitate to reach out to any of the 3 of us about that. Otherwise, I think we're good to wrap up 4 minutes early. All right. Thank you. Thank you for your continued attention.